Chapter 3, Assessment with Diverse Populations. As we learned about in our multicultural counseling course, culture, race, and ethnicity are factors that can impact privilege and can impact individuals' experiences in the counseling and therapeutic process. So that's just as true, if not more true, when we're talking about testing and assessment. So there are a lot of factors related to cultural diversity and different aspects of diversity that can play into testing and assessment in different ways. So we'll talk about how these factors can impact sometimes the validity and reliability of an assessment or a test, but also the client's experience and the testing individual's experience. So the counselor, whoever is administering the test, these experiences are often shaped too by aspects of diversity that we'll talk about. So just as a reminder from our multicultural class, some of the terms related to diversity that we'll talk about are culture, which is a set of beliefs, values, customs, and other things that drive cognition, behavior, or perception. So culture is just a sense of identity. And as we talked about in our multicultural class, all individuals have their unique sense of culture and identity, regardless of other categories within which they may fall. Then there's race, which is tied to appearance. So this is often linked with how we physically identify, or often things like skin tone, how we might categorize individuals to be different from one another. And then there's ethnicity. So this is the cultural group with which someone shares an identity or a heritage. And sometimes race and ethnicity may align, and sometimes they may not. So as a reminder, we need to consider all of these factors in addition to things like ability and language and other factors that we will talk about in this chapter when we are thinking about incorporating testing and assessment into counseling. So cultural considerations that we may need to think about, or questions that we may need to consider when we are choosing a test or an assessment for a client, might include some of these questions that really just help us to determine if the test or assessment that we're giving is appropriate and how to best use that in the counseling setting. So you might ask yourself, is this assessment appropriate and accurate given certain cultural identities? So in terms of the norming information for that assessment, is the individuals or the groups that they used to norm this test or assessment representative of the type of client that I'm working with? So you'll find, particularly with some of the earlier developed assessments that we talked about in the previous chapter, a lot of them are normed on heterosexual individuals. A lot of them are normed on Caucasian and largely Western individuals. And so it's important to look at, in some of the newer versions of these assessments, did they expand the diversity of the norming pool? And you should be able to find all of this information in the brochures or in the testing manuals for different assessments that you might use. So in our course shell, I'll add to some of the modules and to our course page a listing of different brochures that include a lot of the information about some of the newer versions of the tests and assessments that we will look at in this class. So you can look at some of that information for yourself. And that's something to consider when you're going to give any kind of assessment or test with a client. So then you need to consider, how do elements of assessment impact the client, or the client impact the assessment? So this is looking at things like language and ability. And so, is this assessment accessible for my client? Is it in a language or a translation that the client can understand? And sometimes with language translation, which we'll talk about later in this chapter, the translation doesn't necessarily capture sort of the essence of the meaning of the words that were in the original assessment. So in different languages, things don't always translate very smoothly or translate with the same sort of meaning culturally. So even if two cultural groups and languages have the same word, technically, they may mean very different things. And so we have to think about both how the assessment might impact the client in terms of their cultural identity. So not just ability and accessibility, but things like the information that the assessment is asking. Is that something within this cultural group that someone would freely share before they've been able to build rapport and trust with someone? And maybe not. So thinking about the way things are asked, thinking about the kinds of things that we ask, and then also thinking about how all these different identities of the client might impact the outcome of the assessment, so that when we're doing interpretation of the testing or the assessment, we're able to put it in the context of that culture. So we're not just necessarily providing a diagnostic label or interpreting sort of in a vacuum, but we're making sure to mention cultural factors that might be at play in the way that the test or the assessment is scored. Then we might consider, does the design of the assessment represent a barrier to the accessibility for the client? So we'll talk about this later in the current chapter, but we have to make sure that any kind of testing and assessment that we're using is accessible. So making sure that individuals with visual impairment or hearing impairment or communication related disorders are able to understand and participate in the testing in the same way that it's designed for anyone to be able to. This might particularly be the case in education settings where there might need to be some accommodations to make sure that all things that we are using are accessible. And then finally, do client populations have equal access to appropriate assessments? So this is sort of a bigger systems thing. And considering in my practice, in my community, in my school, do all of the clients or students that I'm working with have equal access to the type of assessments that they need to be able to get access to the resources or appropriate diagnoses or IEPs or accommodations that they need? So you might find in communities with lesser resources, doing things like assessments for ADHD can be really challenging because there isn't necessarily access to that information, access to providers who are able to do that, access to insurance to be able to pay for it because assessment is pretty expensive. And so these are the things that we have to consider. We can't just recommend or refer, oh, I think you need to go have this testing done. We have to really think about, do they have access to that testing in the community where they live? There are different ways that a measurement or a test in and of itself can be biased in regard to certain levels of cultural identity or accessibility. And so it's important to be aware of these things and to look at these things in terms of choosing measurements that are appropriate for a client. And this information would be available in the manual or in the psychometric properties that any kind of assessment would have available. So usually when you're going to look at a certain test or assessment, if you've purchased a bunch of them, then you should get an assessment manual or at least a breakdown of these psychometric properties for the test or assessment that you're using. And if you're looking to purchase one, all of these should be available on the manufacturer's website, or a lot of times there's different research that's been published that provides some of this information as different assessments have been developed. And so things to consider: accessibility. So as we talked about in the previous slide, is this measurement designed so that anybody can be able to complete it and complete it accurately? And we'll get into different aspects of ability level and how that'll impact potentially measurements and outcomes later in this chapter. So we see this emerging idea of universal design, and this is a movement primarily in the education sector, but it's also present in assessment and testing because a lot of those are developed within higher education settings or in sort of psychology-based lab settings. And so this universal design idea is a way to create the most accessible experience possible. And so the idea is that the online course that you're teaching, or the environment that you're creating, or the measurement or assessment that you're creating is accessible to everyone. It's universal. And so the design of that is in such a way that it would be very simple to make accommodations for anyone who needs them. And some of those accommodations might already be built in. So that people can use adaptive technology or they can use different things to be able to take the assessment and it still be accurate in terms of the outcome. So then we have predictive bias. which is a statistical measure. And so this is the idea of testing different kinds of assessments during their development process to find out if certain variables, certain outcomes, certain things that are being measured by assessments, if those things change just based on some sort of characteristic or group identity. And so this is essentially looking at if we group people together based on a cultural identity, or if we group people together based on race, or if we group people together based on age or gender, or any number of different kinds of identities a person might hold, can we then predict a certain outcome of some variable that's included in the assessment only based on those identity principles? And if that's the case, then that measurement is most likely biased for or against those identities, because it can be that certain subgroups of identity might do better on different kinds of assessments than would be accurate, and some might not do as well, or some might have more negative outcomes on assessments. So we have to look at those predictive bias tests, and that's usually involved in the norming process for assessments to find out if there's any kind of bias that's built into the way that the measurement's designed in the first place. And then we have the differential item functioning, which is a statistical test also, and it helps to identify that measurement bias in terms of individual items. So it looks at the same sort of thing as predictive bias, but looks at for each item on an assessment, does the score differ among different groups? So looking at only based on those identity principles, are there significant differences in the way that an item is scored? And this might look at things like language interpretation. This might look at things like cultural interpretation of the way the items are worded or the way that they are scored or measured. And things like how open someone would be to being honest about the types of things that the assessment is asking them in the first place. And so it's looking at how are items in terms of the language, in terms of the meaning, in terms of the specific information that we are asking for, how are those interpreted differently by different cultural groups? So there are several factors in terms of the actual test taker, so the student or the client, that could bias the outcome of an assessment. So language, again, is really important in terms of making sure that someone really understands the meaning of the questions and understands the meaning of the way things are measured. There's test wiseness, which is essentially this idea of how easy it would be for someone to be able to guess the correct answer without knowing the correct answer. And so we might call these things like test-taking skills. And particularly with standardized testing in schools, we now see that teaching curriculum in K through 12 environments is actually trying to teach this idea of test wiseness. So when we are looking at things like curriculum focused on standardized test prep, the teachers are really helping the students to develop test wiseness. So if they don't know the correct answer, they could make an educated guess and still potentially get the answer right. So this is definitely a bias factor in things like standardized testing. And there's arguments that, like for example, for SATs, ACTs, individuals who have more economic advantage are able to enroll in things like prep courses. We see the same thing for the GRE and the LSAT and the MCAT. And so we see that individuals who take these prep courses do a lot better on the test. And there can be sometimes partnerships between the individuals who make the test and the individuals who make the test prep materials. And so there's some question of, is this a bias of the outcome? Are these individuals actually scoring better on the test because they have more knowledge or ability or aptitude? Or is it because they're going through these courses that are teaching them test wiseness? So it's a bit of a controversy in terms of certain types of testing and the ways that test wiseness can impact the outcome of that testing. So then, of course, there's motivation and anxiety. So how motivated are individuals to take the test? And is there any kind of anxiety related to that? So are they nervous about answering questions accurately because of the outcome? Are they nervous about taking standardized tests in schools? The fact that we even have this idea of test anxiety, and it's fairly ubiquitous in terms of our cultural knowledge of it in the Western world, is really something. And so someone saying, I'm not a good test taker, and that would bias the outcome of the test, is this anxiety so much impacting your ability to function in a test taking situation that you would have a lower outcome on your test than you would if that anxiety were not in place. And then, of course, cultural differences, which we have talked about in terms of the way an individual might understand or relate to a test or answer questions about different items on a test, and then how well that test was designed in terms of capturing cultural identity in a way that doesn't impact the outcome. In addition to potential areas of bias that can come from the test taker, there are also areas of bias that can come from the examiner, so the person who's giving the test or the assessment. And so in a lot of cases, this will be you as a school counselor or the community-based counselor. And so there are just different things to be aware of in terms of how you as examiner can impact the outcome of an assessment. And a lot of these connect back to these ideas of cultural competency that we practice in counseling anyway. But specifically to testing and assessment, it's important to be aware of cultural identities and values that we hold, that the client holds, how those things might fit together in a way or clash in a way that represents countertransference, language differences, and making sure we have appropriate translation services that are available if needed, and we're using appropriate translations of assessments as much as possible. So really, in the best case scenario, you would have your assessment in the native language of the client, not necessarily just having someone who's a translator read things to the client, because again, there can be some linguistic differences in the way that we describe things in terms of different language and different cultural identities. Cultural competency, which we should practice anyhow, our own self-awareness of those things, our understanding of the client's point of view and motivation for taking the test in the first place. So again, how open are they to sharing this information? Are these things that are commonly talked about in their families? And so in some cultures, we don't talk about things in families in the same sorts of ways. So when we're measuring things like adverse childhood experiences, some of those may be things that just were not on the radar for kids growing up, just based on their cultural identity or based on the community in which they lived. So just things to be aware of in the way that we're interpreting the assessments. And then, of course, motivation. So we have to be aware of taking into account if someone is feeling hyper motivated or less than motivated to complete an assessment. So again, being aware of things like test wiseness, being aware of students who might struggle with test anxiety or low motivation for testing, and making sure that we take the outcome into that context. And then, of course, cultural bias in terms of any kind of testing and assessment that would lead to clinical diagnosis, which we've talked about quite a bit in our diagnosis class. So in terms of the way we think about these biases and different types of testing and assessment, we might look at if a test, an assessment, or a construct is more of an emic or an etic principle. So etic principles are universal qualities that we assume exist across cultures. And so assessments that are more etic focus on things that are considered quote unquote cross-cultural. So intelligence or personality, those kinds of testing view all test takers alike. They don't take into context, they don't consider the context or the cultural identities. So we see this a lot in things like standardized testing, in aptitude testing, in intelligence testing. And of course, we know that cultural identity, ability level, those kinds of things, test anxiety, motivation, all of these would play into the outcomes of those types of assessments. So we just have to be aware if the test or assessment that we're using is designed with more of an etic perspective, then we have to think about how we might have to put the outcomes into context. Then there are more emic perspective or emic focused assessments. And so these examine behavior within a cultural context. And so the way that they're designed, the questions are more subjective. The questions ask things in multiple different ways so they can try to capture a more accurate picture of what's going on. And they consider ways to use criteria more relative to characteristics of cultural identity. And this is where you'll see certain assessments that have been around for a long time talk about in their brochures, in their test manuals, that they've been normed across so many different cultural groups. They've been normed internationally. They've been normed in different languages and translated into different languages. And so these more emic-focused things like certain diagnostics, like wellness, like a lot of assessments that are out there for things like discrimination, racial identity, those sorts of things are more emic-focused. And so they look at culturally specific constructs. You might see some differences in the assessment from one language translation to a next. And you'll see in particular, they use things like multiple questions that sort of ask the same kind of thing so they can try to capture that picture of what's going on or capture the context of the client. And that's taken into account in the way that you would score the assessment. So also in terms of different types of assessments that are emic, we of course would have things that are very subjective. So we've already talked about this a little bit in this chapter already, but in terms of linguistics, we have to be aware of clients where English is a second language. We have to be aware of how much language proficiency they have in English. And we have to make sure that if we're using translated assessments, that they're translated with some amount of accuracy and then also with some adapting in terms of cultural context and adapting in terms of language meaning. Not just translating plainly from English to another language, but thinking about how words have different meaning in different languages. So we need to consider the language needs of the client and make sure that the assessments that we are using are going to be accessible for that client. So there might be this really wonderful test that I'd like to use, but it's not written in a way that is linguistically appropriate for my client, then I really can't use it. I need to find a different way to measure that construct in a way that captures and allows my client to be able to communicate effectively the answers to those questions on the test or assessment. And then we've talked a little bit about norming and validation. So making sure that any kind of translations that you're using have separate norming and validation information for those translations, and not just that they've plainly hired someone to translate an assessment. And of course, we would never want to translate something ourselves. Ideally, we would use a translated version of a test because when they translate a certain test or assessment, they do additional norming and validation with cultural groups, with language groups, to make sure that it's still accurate. So then with individuals with disabilities, under the IDEA law, there are different areas of ability level that we would need to make accommodations for. And your book lists all of the different categories, particularly for children, in terms of IDEA and the need to make accommodations. So just thinking about individuals with visual impairment, so if they're not able to read the test or assessment, is it available on the computer so they can use a screen reader? Is it available in large print so that perhaps they can read it with a magnifying glass if they have visual impairment but are not legally blind? So what kinds of accommodations we might need to make in terms of a client really being able to actually read an assessment. And we have to make sure that, because it seems like the simple solution would be, oh, I'll just read it aloud. But that can really impact the outcome of the assessment as well. So is the test designed to be given orally? And potentially are the questions that are asked on the assessment something that the client would actually answer aloud? Or will they be maybe more embarrassed or unsure of themselves answering a question out loud, which could impact the outcome? Same with hearing impairment. So if they're unable to hear me giving instructions about how to take a test or an assessment, is there a clear script that they can follow along with me so that they know what I'm saying, or they're able to hear me with competency? Or are they able to read the instructions for an assessment so that they're able to understand what to do? And then in terms of the evaluation outcomes and in terms of the way that I'm interpreting those assessments, I need to make sure that individuals with hearing impairment are able to understand my interpretation of those things. So can I get an American Sign Language interpreter to come sit in on the session where I'm going over the interpretation of the test? Or am I able to give them a letter that really details things? And then are they able to ask questions so that I make sure that they understand? So thinking about ways to accommodate hearing impairment. In terms of intellectual disability, there's a lot of information in your book about ways to accommodate needs for understanding and competency and proficiency. So making sure that individuals are able to understand what tests and assessments really mean, what the language really means in terms of like reading comprehension, or I know when I was working with young adults with autism and intellectual disabilities, when we would give testing or assessment, we had to be really careful to make sure that they understood what the words meant and that they were able to answer accurately, because often they would just want to answer in the affirmative because they would want to make sure that the person administering the test felt like they were paying attention. And so we had to pause and really make sure that that answer was accurate, and not just that they didn't understand, that they wanted to move on, or they wanted to make sure that the testing individual, like the examiner, knew that they were paying attention. Communication disorders. So similarly, can someone answer questions accurately? Are they able to understand language accurately? How are they best able to communicate their answers to things like subjective assessments? Is it better for them to write them down? Is it better for them to draw them? What kinds of things do we need to make sure that we do so that we know that individuals understand and are able to communicate back to us accurately beyond just considerations of language and language translation, but actually an understanding and being able to communicate in general related to things like learning disabilities and communication-based mental health disorders. And then children with disabilities need accommodation in terms of IDEA and different accommodations that might be needed in terms of the way that we administer testing and the way that we score testing. So we've talked a little bit about testing accommodations already, but things like giving extra time, things like being able to have a test read aloud and then answer aloud, different kinds of things. And depending on what test and assessment you're using, you have a different sort of variety of accommodations that you can work with. So in some of the more common standardized tests in schools, there are already accommodation manuals that would be included in a 501, 504 plan or in an IEP or something like that. And there's already guidance from the manufacturers of the test or assessment and ways to do that. So depending on your setting and how you're working with children, you just might need to think about and reference with the manufacturer of the assessment what ways to make sure that you're accommodating for all of these different IDEA categories.